Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Laura Taylor. I'm a Global Change Fellow with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as CCAST. Today, we are going to be doing the State of Change documentary screening and discussion with Michelle Lotker, right over here. And today I will be co-hosting with Darian Ng, as well as we have Jules Jolly, Miley Neal, Nathan Shunk, and Megan Carr all working behind the scenes in order to make this run all smoothly. I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of background on the State of Change and like which clips we'll specifically be showing today. So State of Change is a documentary series that tackles the question of how local North Carolinians are exposed to, impacted by, and adapting to climate change. It's a part of the Pulitzer Center's Connected Coastlines Reporting Initiative, which is a climate reporting initiative in United States like coastal states that brings together different independent journalists in newsrooms to report on climate change impacts on coastal populations. So the three clips we're specifically going to be streaming today are from State of Change Natural Solutions, which focuses on how North Carolinians are specifically adapting to climate change using innovative solutions. The first clip we'll show is Farmers Think Outside the Box with Conservation Tillage, which dives into like the benefits of no-till agriculture. Next, we're going to be showing how rewetting Pocosin peatlands protects the ancient carbon they hold, which talks about the restoration of Pocosin peatlands. And then lastly, we'll be showing Planting Grasslands Helps Fight Climate Change, which discusses the importance of planting native grassland species. The clips themselves will take about 30 minutes to show, and afterwards we'll have an open Q&A with Michelle. Darren will be facilitating the Q&A and kicking us off with like the first question. For those of you that are on Zoom, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any point. You'll be able to like upvote other questions that are submitted there as well. And I'm going to get started with the first clip and hopefully it works.
Hello. 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 You all are eating the tender grass. You don't like the grass over there? As a livestock grower, you're a grass grower. We're at Blackwell's Farm, located here in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. I'm a co-owner with my brother, Seth Blackwell. We were born and raised here on the farm. We spent time in corporate America, the both of us, and we returned to the family farm. We are multi-generational farmers from a multi-generational farming family. We basically raise beef cattle and seasonal specialty crops.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I just wanted to get rid of the flipping controls.
We're gonna give them some apples today. We're gonna give them a treat. How do I feel about my cows? I love my cows. My cows are my friends, okay? This, what you're looking at right here, is daikon radishes. That's mainly turnip greens in there. And if you go all the way up the hill, it's all mustard green. It's a totally different picture. It's a different scenario. It's a different process when it comes to farming. It used to be we would get days of rain. Now it's kind of like a downpour. It comes all within a limited time period. We didn't experience those extremes. We did have drought times, you know, growing up where things had to be watered through irrigation. But today, it's an ongoing pattern.
Climate change is going to affect growers in very different ways depending where you are in the United States. Here in North Carolina, we have some predictions on what's going to happen. So we're going to see maybe annually the same amount of rainfall, but it'll be distributed very differently.
It's also predicted that droughts are going to be much more common, much more intense, and last for longer duration. When precipitation does happen, you want to ensure that it gets into the ground.
We were always taught you had to turn the land. You need to turn it 18 inches or so. You need to allow it to rest for the winter. I looked at the fields of where we were with our crops that we were planting, and I said, in order for this to work with extreme weather changes and the patterns that we are now confronted with, we're going to have to go with a no-till to limited till process. We need to do less disturbance of the land.
Tillage is a way of cultivating the soil or preparing it for a seed bed. It warms the soil in the springtime. It also can dry out the soil if it's too wet, and then it also reduces weed pressure in that soil system.
There are advantages of tilling in terms of, seedbed preparation, but the trade-off is you've broken up the soil, all the aggregates, all the soil structure is damaged, you're losing organic matter, and then the soil becomes less productive over time. So we're standing in one of the few long-term studies here in North Carolina looking at the impact of soil management, in particular tillage.
The study started in 1984 by two researchers at NC State, Paul Denton and Michael Wagger, and they were interested in better understanding how conservation tillage could potentially prevent erosion in these really erodible landscapes of the Piedmont. Within this field, we have randomized tillage treatments.
Looking at things as intense as moldboard plow, where we flip the soil over completely down to 8 to 12 inches, heavily disturbed, versus chisel plowing, kind of semi-disturbed, and then disking, which is kind of middle ground. We compare it to no-till, which is where we do not touch the soil. The only interaction we have with the soil is when we plant the crops in this tiny slot, so leave it be. So this is a great example kind of showing the dramatic differences between tillage sites over the long term. On the left here, up higher, you can see this is the no-till site. It has been tilled for 38 years. On the right here is the moldboard plow, which again was heavily disturbed, and we've lost, half a foot of soil from erosion and soil organic matter being lost. It takes, centuries to build up topsoil, so this is a permanent loss and won't be fixed anytime soon.
Across the board, for all years, conservation tillage, and in particular no-till, had more consistent and higher yields in comparison to the conventionally tilled plots. And in particular, we saw that we had higher yields in these drier conditions, so we thought that potentially water could be the answer. Are these conservation tillage systems able to increase soil moisture content more so than our conventionally tilled systems?
When we till over the long term, what we're doing is we're slowly degrading the soil. We're losing soil carbon, especially at the surface. We're losing aggregates, and we're losing the integrity of the soil. So when rain does occur, it breaks up anything on the surface and causes a surface seal or crusting. And once the surface is crusted, that has huge implications on water movement in the soil.
And here is some nice evidence of crusting. So you can even just peel this off.
When a rain event does occur, a large portion of that water will hit that crust and move off. The only place we don't see crusting is in the no-till plots. We talk about no-till and we talk about surface residue. What we mean here is, this is from the year before. This is all leftover corn stalks, corn stover, having material on the surface that kind of blankets and provides armor and protection to the bare soil. At this field site where you have no-till, where you have got nice soil structure, it allows water to move in, versus a surface seal, these soybeans or corn are effectively having different precipitation regimes. That water is not being moved through the root zone, and so they're kind of experiencing completely different conditions depending on your soil health. This is soil from the moldboard disc plot, and Alex is going to bring in soil from the no-till plot. The colors are pretty bold there. I didn't expect it to be that different. This soil has some nice granular structure and is darker because of higher amounts of soil organic carbon. 38 years ago, this is all the same soil type. It was all, one field. They were growing probably hay and corn, and now, after 38 years, it looks like you have fundamentally different soils. You can really change the direction of the soil type just with some simple management like no-till.
You got a key? We purchased this no-till seeder in 2019 through some funding. See the grass coming up all in here? This was done with no-till.
As you look, you can see some of the spikes. And what it does, it doesn't disturb your natural grass. All it does is just punches a little hole there for the seeds to fall into and to germinate.
As a farmer, it's all about efficiency. It's all about profitability. And we were able to cut our costs as to the dollars that it took to go into those fields. We were able to build the soil quality. We were able to cut down on fertilizer costs. So we've been able to minimize costs as a result of going with regenerative agriculture.
Our goal is to be able to support farmers to make these transitions into sustainable practices.
The large majority of our land is managed either in row crops or in pasture. As a state in general, if we want to look at natural climate solutions, the vast acreage is managed land.
And so if we're able to increase just a little bit of carbon in all of those fields, cumulatively, we can have a large impact.
You have to figure out today what works on your farm. There's nothing etched in stone. It's a matter of thinking outside of the box. Hello.
Okay, so that was the first clip on no-till agriculture, and the next one is what it says on the screen, how rewetting Pocosin peatlands protects the ancient carbon that they hold.
Peat is really just decayed, partially decayed plant material.
So this is the leaf litter. This is what makes the peat.
It doesn't decay very fast.
If you break the leaves, it's very aromatic. This is very unpalatable. For the microbes, it's very difficult to break down. It'd be the difference between having a candy bar or trying to eat a piece of wood. So at the end of a year, you'll still have 50% of this material, whereas in a typical forest, all of this would decompose.
People don't realize there's more carbon stored in the peatlands of the world than there are all the forests. If you look at a typical forest soil, it's 1 or 2%. Peat is basically 80 to 90% organic matter. That's why they're so great at storing carbon. To get to this goal of zero carbon emissions, we have to keep reducing this amount of carbon dioxide release. If you just let these areas lie fallow and decompose, it can equal up to 2.5% of our annual goal of reducing carbon emissions for the entire United States. It's an enormous amount. If only 25% of the drained peatlands in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia caught on fire in 1 year, it could equal to 18% of our annual U.S. goal of carbon dioxide reduction. So we're trying to keep as much carbon in the system as we can, and wetlands are a natural sequester of carbon.
We are in eastern North Carolina in the Albemarle-Pamlico watershed. We're passing by the farmland to the south, and then right up here to the east of here is the National Wildlife Refuge starting up. Pocosin Lakes itself is 110,000 acres of primarily wetlands. You will hear folks refer to peatlands elsewhere, but Pocosin is specific to this area because of the Native Americans that called them that.
You might think from this perspective that we're just looking at an absolutely flat landscape, but that's really not the case.
They're domed, bogs are domed, and essentially don't have streams. They just basically get their water source from the rain.
What's interesting about these Pocosin wetland systems is they are not chronically inundated or flooded. The groundwater level is actually below the soil surface, which is a normal thing. The water level is such that it's saturating that peat underground, but it's not ponding and pooling.
We get a lot of questions like, so where's the wetlands? But that's all around us, actually. The wetness is in the soil.
This is an area we've been working for over 10 years. This is probably some of the deeper peat here. We could have up to 8 to 10 feet of peat.
The South has 20% of the peatlands in the United States, which people can't believe, but we do.
So this is an instrument that basically you put in the hole. Oh, that's good. That's encouraging. And you turn it 180 degrees, and this paddle basically cuts a piece of peat. And we pull it back out of the hole. Lift with the knees. There we go. And we can keep track of how far we are from the surface and get this vertical profile of information about how the peat has changed over time. Let's see what we've got. Feels good. So there, yeah. That's a good one.
That's a beautiful core. That core probably represents the base, probably about 2,000 to 3,000 years in age.
These landscapes started to change in the 60s and 70s when there was ditching and draining, primarily with the hopes of them being converted to agricultural fields. The vast majority of the Poquoson Lakes portion of the refuge was drained around that time. I think one of the things that's unique about these habitats is they're fire dependent. Most people think of forest fires and wildfires starting in the canopy or the above ground layer, but peatlands actually, the soil itself is combustible.
What you have to think about is that in a natural state, the majority of the time that underlying soil is going to be at least, partially saturated, and it's going to be wet. So a fire would move through these systems and burn the vegetation, but it wouldn't actually get down into the soil and burn. But when these soils are, very, very dry, so during natural drought periods or in a ditch situation where the water level is being artificially dropped lower than it would be naturally, it makes them very, very vulnerable to catching on fire. In 2008, for example, there was a wildfire that lasted for several months.
2008, we had a fire that was so big you could smell the smoke in Durham, and it went all the way to Asheville. We burned off 9.9 teragrams of carbon. That's the amount of carbon dioxide released by 2.5 million cars driving 12,000 miles in a year in one fire.
The fire will move underground, and we've seen, repeated fires out here that will burn away feet of soil, 4 to 5 feet in the most intensely burned areas.
1,000 years of accumulation could go up in smoke in literally an hour.
Yeah.
If it's drained.
If we put water back in the soil, we provide for the habitat, but we're also making the landscape more resilient to the effects of catastrophic wildfire. The most altered part of the refuge has a ditch network every mile by half mile. And then even within that, every 320 feet, there are V ditches. It was purchased by the Conservation Fund and donated to the Fish and Wildlife Service in 1990. So one of the first things that managers at that time did was to essentially develop the plan for how to fix the drainage network on the landscape.
So the main way that we achieve hydrologic restoration or re-wetting these Poquoson wetlands is by installing flashboard riser water control structures. And essentially it's a culvert pipe, and you're able to control what the water level is in the ditch that's just uphill of that structure. So across the front here is the riser pipe with 3 weir slots. So the refuge management staff can put wooden boards down into those weirs up to the height that they would like the water to be ideally before it then would spill over the boards and continue down. So we stage these structures gradually up the slope of a Poquoson dome, or the hill of this wetland, about every 1 foot of elevation increase. So we're very gradually stair-stepping the groundwater level back up this Poquoson dome. We're re-wetting with rainwater, we're re-wetting these soils from below. From my perspective, the most important kind of next steps is doing this on private land. If a private landowner were to own an area that was previously ditched and drained Poquoson wetland, they could use the same sort of infrastructure that is being used at project sites all across the coastal plain here in North Carolina, re-wet their lands, and then generate carbon credits that could be sold on the voluntary carbon market.
It's a market-based approach to restorations. These markets have emerged looking at ways that folks can invest in essentially a verified carbon offset, something to offset greenhouse gas pollution. And measuring it's important because you want to make sure that it's truly carbon that otherwise wouldn't have been sequestered or stored in the land. And so these measurement methodologies and approaches are just a way for anyone who invests in that market to know that it was carbon that actually is moving the needle to address the problem of greenhouse gas emissions in a meaningful way.
We did these studies over a period of 10 years, and it's an amazing amount of carbon that we can store in these systems.
If we don't manage these lands the right way, we'll never get it back because of how slowly they formed over time. We really have to steward them right. All of our work that we're trying to do internationally to address climate, there's no way we get there without our peatlands functioning.
And then we have the last clip, planting grasslands helped by climate.
Grasslands are a fundamental part of our landscape. People are just starting to think about the value of grasses on their own. These amazing plants that are indigenous to the Piedmont, very abundant and very easy to plant. We think that grasslands are about a third of the global carbon sinks. You just think about all of our roadways and backyards and empty lots that could be turned into grasslands and could sequester carbon and foster biodiversity, filter stormwater. That's an incredible potential. There are records that we can read dating back to the 1500s about grasslands. Anyone that came here that was a European would write about wading through the savannas.
And a lot of that had to do with how indigenous people had been managing the land for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
The early explorers, they found these grand open areas, and the first explorer to this area, John Lawson, he could almost always smell smoke because of the American Indians burning here.
That's one of the things that made it so easy for Europeans to take over, is that it was already cleared. People weren't clearing as many trees as we imagined. This was already a cultivated place. Especially here in the Southeast and in North Carolina, grasslands have this very, very, very strong connection with human beings.
The plants that make up the Piedmont prairie, the Piedmont savanna, are what are called heliophytic, so they're sun-loving. And once they start to get shaded out, they decline.
And so one of the places we find some of these plants that have mostly vanished from other parts of the landscape is in power line easements and along roadsides. We find these plants that look like they quote unquote belong in the Midwest. We find the big prairie grasses, we find the asters, we find the echinaceas, the coneflowers. We find them in these places because they are the right kinds of conditions.
We are standing at the highest point in the Penny's Bend Nature Preserve. The plants that grow in so many of these sites grow in very poor soil conditions. When the summertime, when it dries out, it's like concrete, but in the winter when it's wet, it's gummy. That's why they have deep roots, because they can spread out and grab what's out there.
They could be up to 10 feet deep. They have a whole relationship, a whole ecosystem of microbes. There are studies that show that the chemicals that come from grassland roots actually stay in the soil up to centuries, and so they're working to sequester carbon for centuries.
One of the important things to remember about plants is that they cannot move. And so that fact changes everything about how they have to behave and how they have to be set up to take all the different things that they will be surrounded by.
Native plants have a relationship to this place for thousands of years.
Plants that are from here are able to cope with all the different dynamics that are going to happen in the place. The times it will get the driest, the times it will get the wettest, the times it will get the coldest, the time it will get the hottest. Plants have to prepare for the extreme events.
There are a lot of climate models out there, and still it's uncertain what's going to happen as climate changes. Some of the models show that the Piedmont will become hotter and drier. Well, that's okay for these Piedmont savanna species because that's what they're adapted to. They have seen so many different climates throughout their, let's say, genetic memory. So we're hoping that the Piedmont is a place where there's a tremendous amount of resilience among the native plants here.
One thing about prairie plants is that they thrive in degraded landscapes. And so if we think about all of our landscapes now as we're developed, so many of them are, quote, degraded, and people just sort of give up on them and think, maybe I'm not going to plant anything. But actually, they're the perfect landscapes, the perfect situation for prairie plants like this.
So this is the Chatham Mills Pollinator Garden, as stewarded and designed by Debbie Roos, who is an extension agent here in Chatham County. And as you can see, these are parking lot medians, right? These are areas that would have been planted in crepe myrtles and monkey grass and some other things. Look what can happen with just a little bit of attention, some knowledge, some know-how. Like now this place is a haven for all these plants, for butterflies and for bees and all kinds of things. And it changes the feel of where we are, right? This feels like North Carolina in the way that like a strip mall parking lot would never.
When we're thinking about native plants in this area, we have to think about grassland plants, not just woodland plants. And as a result, we need to think about what that means about a garden. A lot of our historical gardens are based on a dominant English idea of a formal garden with a yard and very controlled plantings. That's not necessarily made out of the plants that are native to this region and that would thrive the most in this region. So that means that we should be thinking about planting in a different way. It's like a troll. It's a little troll.
All right, you ready? Yeah. We are here in Carver, North Carolina. And we're here at the Tony and Nellie Strayhorn house. This house has been here in my family for 7 generations. It was built in 1879 by brick masons, well, my family brick masons, and they also were farmers and they tended this land.
I'm Landon's cousin. We're working on plants together, thinking about ways that we can steward the land in this area for another 9 generations.
My great-grandmother was basically the last person to actually garden in this area, and I felt like it was a need to kind of restore that project. I know it was some flowers, a cardinal, maybe a cardinal plant, but it was she had a lot of diversity.
When you're growing these kinds of grassland gardens, phase 1 doesn't need mulch. We're just gonna keep the grass sort of to like outcompete the weeds, and the whole goal is eventually our native grasses are gonna outcompete these grasses. The best time is to plant them when they're sleeping, and so they're little like this, and then use all of that energy when they start to grow to like put down their roots and like settle into their new home. It's kind of like the plants are the soil amendment. You don't need this extra mulch, you don't need this extra compost, it's really the plants.
So one of the things we don't necessarily think about when we think about grasslands is its ability to really help with our sort of climate crisis, right? Plants like these tall, long-lived grasses like big blue stem or Indian grass, what we don't often understand is those plants can live for hundreds of years. And so over the course of that time, they are taking all of this atmospheric carbon and taking it from the air and putting it underground, where as long as we don't plow it up, we'll stay there.
90% of grassland's carbon sinks are below ground, which is really incredibly stable.
It is sequestering so much carbon and sequestering it in a way that trees can't. So grasslands play a huge role in keeping carbon in the soil.
Restoring degraded landscapes could sequester 37% of the carbon that we need to keep temperature rise under 3.6 degrees. To me, that's really powerful because it's sort of like a low-hanging fruit. Like, we need to create all these new technologies and like switch the grid, and there's all these things we need to do, but like, why would we not just be like planting backyard gardens and restoring landscapes, especially when they're low maintenance plants like this that were such an integral part of the landscape and look pretty. So our goal is to get people to think about the past as it informs the future and create sustainable futures.
It's an easy solution. We're not trying to, build some machines that are gonna live and spin around in the ocean, right? This is already here. You can drive on like any highway almost and see this same like starry pattern, which is not true in other places. This looks like here.
There's nothing more North Carolina than this.
Okay, so those are all the clips that we have. If you want to see more of these clips, there are a bunch more clips, even in our documentary up on the PBS Data Change website. Just Google PBS Data Change. They cover a wide range of topics, all surrounding the conversation about climate change. They're all very interesting watches. I highly recommend checking them out if you're interested in seeing some more. Might be too much.
Everybody awake.
Yeah, so for now, we'll move on to the discussion and Q&A portion of tonight, and we're very lucky to have Michelle Lotker join us. She produced all the segments that we saw tonight here. And how this is going to work is for the folks in the audience, if you have a question or a comment, just raise your hand and I'll call on you and we'll get to your questions one at a time. For the folks online, just enter your questions into the Q&A chat box. We have a team of very professional people keeping an eye on everything, and they will relay your questions as they come in. And yeah, we can hopefully have a very nice discussion about the clips that we saw and science communication in general.
So to kick things off, Michelle, could you give us a quick introduction to yourself? And we would love to know about your background and what led you to your current position doing science media and producing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for being here, everybody, and thanks for having me. So I work currently with PBS North Carolina, and I'm on the science team there. We have a year-round science show where we're doing all kinds of different storytelling, and then State of Change is sort of this more condensed project that's really focused on climate change impacts and solutions in North Carolina. The way I got to where I am today is kind of a really windy path. I originally was studying to be a scientist doing environmental science. I did work as an environmental scientist for a few years, but I also had always done photography and documentary work, and eventually figured out that there was a path that could combine both of those things. And that was quite a while ago when it wasn't as, I guess, widely known science communication as this thing and career path you could choose. I feel now so lucky that everybody understands what that is, and there's so many great things like this that you can come to, and courses and training and everything to get people. Everybody seems way more excited on board with what science communication is, so that's awesome. But along the way, I did a lot of documentary style work, even a lot of work that wasn't necessarily science focused. And I freelanced for a while, which meant I did all kinds of, corporate interview people kind of work too. And all of that just gave me a bunch of different skills that I now bring to the work that I do for PBS. So I do think that informs the way that I tell stories. I'm very people focused. I think that's a great way to approach science storytelling. And my documentary work definitely helped me shape that. And what other questions did you just ask me?
Oh, that was great. Getting your background in your introduction. So we can open the floor up to questions in person and online. If anyone has any.
Yeah.
Decide to keep the story.
Just in this project or in general?
In this project.
Okay, so I was asked, I don't know if they can hear that as well, so I'll just repeat a little bit. How do I pick the stories that I tell, specifically in these project, the climate change series? So that's a great question. A lot of it is when I hear something I'm interested in, but I'm on a bunch of different newsletters and following a lot of people that are doing climate related work. And so I'm kind of keeping an eye out for issues and things that are sort of at the forefront of what people are focusing on. I talk to a lot of scientists and researchers and even just communications people at different universities to find out what are people focused on. I think if we're talking about how do I pick a story that I know will be a good video story that I should tell in this format, looking for a topic that is visual, right? There are a lot of things that are really interesting but would be a great blog post and not so much a good video. So I'm looking for a story where something's actually happening that I can film, especially in whatever timeline I'm working on. With this series, as you mentioned, these stand alone as individual stories online, but they also come together into a longer piece. So you can kind of get a sense of the through line of carbon storage in the ground, natural solutions. That was true that season. So I was looking for stories that mesh together well that way. And yeah, just looking for stories where there's real people that can talk about the issue and can bring it to life in a way that you wouldn't get from reading an academic paper or something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
With climate change being a hot topic in politics, do you ever get pushback from government agencies or local community members on the projects that you do?
That's a great question. So I got the question with climate change being a hot, kind of controversial topic to some people, political topic, I think is a good way to talk about it. Do I ever get pushback from government agencies or people, individuals? So PBS North Carolina is a state organization. We run through the UNC system. We are an educational resource to the state. So I think my goal always in my science communication is to talk about fact-based things. I'm not over sensationalizing anything. Everything I say an expert is telling me is true. And I think that allows me to share this information in a way that isn't viewed as excessively political or sensational. So we're supported by the Pulitzer Center that does a ton of great work, and that helps us also to like do this kind of storytelling. But I mean, when it's out in the world, there's always people that will jump on it and make comments and things like that. But I haven't experienced with this project anything too dramatic, fortunately. Yeah, it's a great question.
What was the most challenging story to film in this series, and how did you pull it off?
Most challenging story to film in the series, and how did I pull it off? So this particular year, these 3 stories are from the same year, last year. Actually, one of the ones you saw, the Coastlines story, was pretty tricky actually to visualize, right? So I wasn't really sure what a Picossan looked like until I got out there with my videographer, Rob, who's awesome, and I wish he could be here today, but and it's really just like a bunch of scrubby bushes. So even on the ground, it's like, I don't know what this is. Like when you tell me like swamp, I'm like, oh, cool. It's gonna have like cool grasses. It's gonna look like a certain thing. And we got there and I was like, oh, okay. Like not very like, I mean, it is beautiful and cool, but it is very, yeah. So that was tricky to visualize, and we couldn't, there are often times when you can't fly drones in certain areas. That's a national wildlife refuge. You cannot fly a drone there. One of the researchers had a little bit of footage that he could share with me, but that aerial view would have also been helpful to me, and that was not something we could really get, but we could get up in a fire tower with them and see a little bit. So I think getting creative with how to show people what that landscape looked like, that would be a challenge, a tricky moment in this series that comes to mind. Yeah.
So kind of on the first question that was asked about, so how do you find the people to tell the stories who aren't researchers? I mean, you know, say you talked about university folks, and I can see how those experts would be obvious candidates, but what about the, you know, the local farmers?
Yeah. So how do I find the people that are in the stories, especially specifically people that are not researchers or people that might be associated with the university? I'm trying to think of different examples. I mean, one of the stories that we didn't see tonight, which was also with a farmer, I found him through the agricultural extension agent that had worked with him and knew him. So finding people that are in the field and are interacting with people that are not academic, that's one way to do it. I'm trying to remember how I found Beverly, who was the farmer. I think she's outspoken enough about that issue that she was interviewed in an article, or you know, I think the luxury would be to be really embedded in an issue long enough that I could magically find people like naturally, but often it's really helpful if someone's already been interviewed or has a little soundbite somewhere that I can say, oh, this is a person I should reach out to. Or a researcher can point me in the right direction if I say to them, hey, I'm trying to find a non-academic, non-science person to talk about this. So that's usually how I do that. Yeah.
So were there any like discussions or considerations for including Indigenous communities in some of these projects as well, in terms of offering any sorts of Indigenous knowledge or expertise for maintaining some of these aspects of the land?
Sure. So with these specific stories in the areas I was in, I didn't come across a story that specifically was about that, but that would be something I would love to include. I think the Picossan aspect, that word is from the Indigenous people that lived there, but I actually did not have anyone mention to me that there was any of that community left in that area stewarding the land. But I think also that's another space where having enough time to build trust with the community to then have them let me help share their story. That's something that requires some more time and would be something I would love to do in the future. And this is a project we're hoping to keep expanding, so something to definitely consider going forward. Thanks.
So as a scientist, I think something that I've been really focused on is learning how to communicate better to a non-scientific audience. So my question is, through this, do you have any advice for scientists on how to kind of craft compelling narratives surrounding their own research when they're talking to people?
Cool. And I forgot to repeat your question, but hopefully they could hear it. So advice how advice for scientists on how to craft narratives and tell their own stories even. Yeah. So I feel like I've been lucky and encountered a lot of scientists that are already doing a great job of this. And I think just the more that it's out there, there's more like workshops and trainings and everything. So that's really great to see and experience. I think like one of the basic things that you all have probably heard before is thinking about how to tell a story in a way that like your grandma could understand what you're talking about. And this is not saying that grandmas are not smart, because my grandma is very smart. But if you, sometimes, I mean, myself included, we get so deeply embedded in our work that we don't know what other people don't even know, because it's so intuitive to us, right? So I think taking that really zoomed out view, how would you talk to someone random on the street about your work, someone in an elevator about your work in a way that doesn't throw a bunch of words at them they've never heard before, right? I think also with research, we can get really focused on the specific thing we're looking at and zooming out to see how does this link into bigger issues and bigger problems. So like, I mean, climate change is a really big thing, so that's easy to pull back and connect to, but how do we talk about why this matters to that person or to their community or bigger communities like their state or their country? I think just like making it a relatable thing, that's something they can connect with, and finding within the research sort of that like aha, like weird fact or like something that could really hook someone and engage them is one thing I would suggest. Yeah, I know there is a second question over here before. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, you said the series is ongoing, and I was wondering what's coming next, what are some of the things you're going to film, and then also, is there something that you wanted to film that just didn't pan out, and why?
Okay, so yeah, series is ongoing. Literally finishing editing the series right now. And we have been releasing all this content around Earth Day every year, so in April, so coming up. There's going to be another great event with I'll just do a little plug. Screening, like before it's even out on broadcast, we're going to screen it at the Museum of Natural Science in Raleigh on April 4th. So there'll be a screening of the half hour and then a Q&A panel with a bunch of different people that are really well versed in the areas that the stories are about. So those stories, I don't know if we have anything out yet about what they're about, but there is a little bit of a farming focus again. I end up skewing towards farming a lot. We're visiting an apple orchard and talking about land conservation and that climate change resiliency impact. We're talking to farmers who are trying to shift our food system towards more resilient varieties of crops and creating more diversity and resiliency there. And solar in rural communities. So how does like solar and farming again coexist, and what kind of installations make sense in rural communities with a really cool company in North Carolina that's doing that. As far as topics that I haven't covered that I'd like to cover, one thing on my mind for the next season is definitely looking more at health impacts related to climate change. And I'll just put the pitch out now. You all will get my email address by the end of this. So if you have any story ideas specifically, I tend to go to the salt marsh and to the farm, and I want to do more urban storytelling because I think there's an audience, obviously, we all live in cities and are interested in how this is impacting us in North Carolina. So health and urban stories. And the tricky thing is I really want these stories to be solutions-based and grounded in real humans and people, so that they're hope and action creating. So finding health impacts and then solutions for them, that's where I'm getting stuck, but I just don't have expertise there. So shout out for anybody wanting to share this with me.
Would you also be interested in coastal community impacts? Because I have seen, well, in undergrad, I had been working on a lot of projects that were specific to that. There's a lot that can go wrong in terms of using the coast as plastic production plants, and those communities that live right next to them have major chronic, lifelong issues that they have to live with and then pass on along, and it's kind of incredibly intense. So I'm just wondering if you'd be interested.
Yes, definitely. So you were mentioning coastal community impacts and specifically plastic production, and that's definitely something that I would love to learn more about. And we actually have a bunch of plastic and PFAS related stories in our Science season this year. So we've been bouncing around the state looking at that in different areas, but yeah, I'd love to more. Send me an email. Who else? Yeah.
Curious on your thoughts. Do you think that combating the environmental crisis is something capable of happening with our current political and economic structures we have in place? Like at the end of one of the clips, the carbon credits were brought up as a solution in a market-based system.
Yeah.
Or do you think that there needs to be systemic changes in order to see permanent sustainable change?
Sure. I mean, my personal answer is yes, as a human speaking. I think one thing that's great about this storytelling is that I am just like sharing information with people, and then people can take all this information and walk away and see how it applies to their life and their situation. I think specifically carbon credits, that what I've learned from doing this work is that there is not one solution, right? So to say, oh, carbon credits are an imperfect solution, right? So, but does that mean we shouldn't do them at all? No, maybe not. So I don't think that any of these things alone are gonna create the change, and I don't think people should be discouraged from trying whatever they can in their communities and in their lives to create any amount of change. As far as like the bigger political question, I don't consider myself an expert on that. I have personal feelings about it, but yeah, I think big change is needed, but all of these smaller impacts, even replanting roadside grass with different grasses to pull carbon out of the air, all these little things we can do that often feel less overwhelming to an individual are still really impactful and important to tackle. Yeah.
In what you just said, it reminded me of an idea that I had. Do you ever broadcast any of these stories or snippets of these stories over the radio? Because I believe in one of the sections, it had something where, oh, people assume that dead soil is like, you're just gonna not touch it anymore, but that actually gives you a great chance to plant the really like resilient plants. And I feel like that would really catch on to those who are really into agriculture, aka the farmers, if they also had a way of like communicating about it, like having widespread.
Yeah, so asking about sharing these stories in different formats almost. So that is something that's interesting you bring up, because we've been talking a little more about doing podcasting and like having an audio only version of any of this. So these stories come out digitally and on broadcast, and they have associated blogs that allow me to like kind of expand with more info than what fits in here and link people to things. We do social media posts, like all the things, but that is one area we haven't tackled yet, but we've been talking about, and we're actually, PBS North Carolina right now is building out its capacity to produce blogs and audio only, but it's something I've thought about a lot, and I actually should try it out and just listen to one without watching and just see how much I need to change it. Like, how much is the visual really mattering to the storytelling, or can these be just like translated directly into audio? It might be something where I need to mix in some narration or something, but definitely something to think about. It'd be really cool. Yeah. Yeah.
While you've been working through this project, is there anything that's been particularly shocking or exciting to you personally, exploring these different stories?
Yeah, so shocking or exciting to me, exploring these stories personally. I was thinking about this because you guys prepped me kind of with that question. I was like, I should think of a good answer for this. I mean, just especially in the ones that we just saw, at that tillage plot where they had done the tillage treatments for 40 years, that visual on the paper of the difference of the two soils, like he was even shocked by that. Like seeing that so clearly was really amazing and eye-opening to me. I think the Pocosin wetlands and how much carbon they store, and the fact that if we don't keep them from burning, like how much can really be lost. Also shocking because again, they don't look like anything. Just like how much a couple feet of soil can have can be thousands of years old. That was really surprising to me. I didn't know that we used to have Piedmont prairies and grasslands. Like, a lot of people are shocked by that when they see that piece. So, I mean, it's the coolest thing about my job for sure, is getting to learn all these different things. But yeah, those were just a few that came up. Yeah.
Curious, it looked like each of the pieces had a university component to it. And I'm curious whether these are, universities are meant to be cutting edge, these are sort of case studies that are potentially going to spill over and catch on. And I'm really curious whether, like, the prevalence of some of these actions, if they still are sort of cutting edge, or was this just kind of like a sample of stuff that people are already doing, more so Beverly, the no-till farmers. Yeah. So I'm curious kind of how prevalent some of these, these actions are.
Okay, so curious about how prevalent and widespread the university supported, like research supported actions are in public.
Yeah, I think so. I think you can go to university and say this is some cutting edge stuff the university research developing or the extension program. But I'm wondering if, let's say Beverly's example, the no-till farming, I wonder if that's a prevalent thing that's sort of actually caught on among the public.
Yeah, so specifically talking about no-till agriculture, I do think that is pretty widespread at this point. The knowledge, I think that technology and style of farming has been around long enough that they have seen the benefits. Enough farmers have seen the benefits and spoken about it. Like, a farmer hearing from Beverly about the impact that they've seen is more impactful than maybe a research paper coming out about why it's better, although farmers also read all kinds of agricultural research. But I do think, and if anybody's a farming expert in the room, please feel free to jump in. But I think that no-till agriculture is a great example of something that is pretty widespread already. And I think there are benefits. That's a great example of something that's beneficial financially for farmers. So it may have spread for a different reason than maybe what we in this room are excited about, like the climate change impact of it. But it is having that impact at the same time because it has all these other benefits that farmers are seeing. And the Pocosin is another great example where the academic research that Duke is doing is supporting funding that people putting money behind protecting the Pocosins because they see this carbon storage value in them now. So private landowners that are out there are seeing the value in rewetting land. There's money behind it. And then that creates that change. Does that answer the question?
It does. I mean, so oftentimes we do, this is this thing we came up with and it really works well, and then we sort of yell into, this.
Yeah.
Really,
yeah, and I think, yeah.
I was just curious whether some of these things that caught on, or if there's some of them are still very much like pilot case study. Ongoing.
Yeah, and I think the hope always is that there is impact with this storytelling where it does spark an idea for someone or help add to the momentum of any of this kind of work that we can be doing to help with climate change. And it's a whole nother line of work to do impact studies around, like, okay, who watched this and then went and did something about it, right? And it's something that's needed more and more, and it's very labor intensive. But that is the hope and the goal with work like this, for sure.
Then one thing, as someone who has worked in the coastal plain and worked in wild prairies, I really appreciate that y'all were able to capture some of the beauty that exists. It's tough to do at the ground level, but it's really nice if you can get a little bit of elevation. Just different complexity. Yeah, and after doing that story, I was talking about, I don't know if they can hear as well, but the wild prairies and how beautiful they are. I mean, once you realize that's what's in all the power cuts everywhere and you start driving around, you're gonna see it everywhere. You're gonna realize it's all over the place. So that was really fun for me. And I really wanted to just fill my yard with all those grasses after I saw that. So hopefully other people will too. I think we have some questions online. Yeah.
We have
Michelle,
time
you have a
for one more
question?
question. We're coming up on the hour soon, but.
Okay.
Is there one online?
Sorry, no, it's really, I wanted to highlight something that Michelle said very quickly, but it feels very important. For those of you who don't know, I'm a science communicator for the South. Michelle and I get comfortable. Michelle said, she hears about a story, she hears about research, she then Googles them and then watches the seminars that they gave, or watches the other talks that they gave. And that's part of the indication of discovery of who not only is doing really cool work, but can tell that story. So let me encourage you as a institutional communicator, please write blogs, film yourself, do a seminar. If you have an opportunity to give a talk and record it and post it online, do it. People like Michelle will watch it.
Yeah, help us find you.
Yes.
Did we have any questions online that we're ignoring? No, not yet. Okay.
We take one last question.
Yeah.
Well, my question is for not science, but production part of it.
Sure.
You know, that 10-minute, approximately 10-minute clip, how many days are you in the field and how many hours of footage do you have that you then get in?
Yeah, so the question's about production, how long are we in the field for a 10-minute story, and then how much footage comes in that we have to kind of wade through. And I say we, and I mean me. This is a lot. It varies for every story. Most of these stories, I would say 2 days in the field. Interviewing takes a lot of time, especially because I get really distracted and I talk to people forever about things. But interviewing and getting set up and making those look and sound really good takes a while. So if I'm also doing something with someone in the field, I usually like to have another day for that. It also depends on travel, like if some of the stuff was on the coast, so that adds to that time. If we're filming for a whole day, I mean, I can have hours and hours of footage. And I will say, as far as production style, if anybody is trying to do science communication and interested in it and thinking about it, as far as process goes, I do a lot of pre-production. I interview people extensively before I'm in the field with them. I don't script the story like expecting them to say certain things, but I build like what do I hope the story arc is so that I can film things that I need and not have too much that I don't need to wade through. Definitely something I've learned as I've done this work to try to help save myself. But yeah, I mean, editing something like that can take 3 or 4 days, like focused, and sometimes it's a little more scattered. Especially these stories with multiple people speaking and weaving that all together. And the process is, I edit it, but then it goes to a team to watch and get a bunch of feedback, and then I go back in and work on it again. So it's definitely a very involved process. And even now watching them, I'm like, oh man, I could do that a little differently, you know? So sometimes you just gotta let it go out in the world and start doing its thing. But yeah, it's really involved.